I would note at this point Senator Grassley had wanted to ask a question, and if he asks, I'm prepared to yield for a question if Senator Grassley wishes to ask me to yield for a question.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I ask my friend from Texas to yield to me without losing his right to the floor for a colloquy.
Would the senator so yield?
With the reservation that I do not lose the right to the floor, I am happy to engage in a colloquy with the Majority Leader.
Madam President, first of all, this is not a filibuster. This is an agreement that he and I made that he could talk. Now, let me say this. We're going to have a vote about 1 o'clock today. And after that's over, we'll follow the rules of the Senate. But my goal is to get this to the House of Representatives as quickly as possible. I think a lot of this time has been, without talking about what's transpired to this point, I would hope that we could collapse the time dramatically and move forward so that the House of Representatives can get what we're going to send back to them. You know, there's a possibility that they may not accept what we send them, and they may want to send us something back. If we use all this time under the rules as they now exist.
President, since I did not yield my right to the floor, I was amenable to a colloquy, but the Majority Leader is giving a speech, and given that, as I understand it, the Majority Leader is not going to consent to extend the time, I have 24 minutes, and so I'm going to reassert my time on the floor since I have not yielded my time on the floor.
If I could ask a consent agreement with my friend.
Is there objection?
There is objection. I'm sorry, I cannot be asked to consent to an unnamed consent agreement. And given that the Majority Leader, as I understand it, is not going to consent to extend my time, then let me say quite simply to the Majority Leader that I will yield time to you for a question when the Majority Leader is prepared to yield to the American people. But I'm not going to yield prior to that because Senator Grassley and Senator Sessions and Senator Inhofe are waiting to speak. And I believe they are endeavoring to listen to the American people. And if the Majority Leader is going to cut off and muzzle us in another 24 minutes, then at this point, I don't feel it is appropriate to allow the Majority Leader to consume that time. And so I will note to any of the senators who are here, if anyone would care to, I know a number of you are waiting to ask questions, that I'm prepared to yield for a question to any of you.
I have a question I'd like to ask my friend from Texas.
Senator from Texas,
without
yield for a
losing
question.
The floor.
Without losing.
I will yield for a question without yielding the floor.
From between 12 and 1 o'clock, would my friend yield to Senator McCain for 15 minutes of that time?
That question is asked, but it will not prove necessary, absent the consent that I promulgated, and I'm assuming that would not be acceptable to the majority, because my time will end at noon. So there's nothing left to yield, because as I understand it on the Senate rules, when the new legislative day begins and the prayer begins, my time yields. So with that...
No, Madam President, he has the right to talk from 12 to 1 o'clock. I'm asking, consent is, would he allow during that period of time Senator McCain to speak for 15 minutes?
Under my understanding, my time expires at noon, and absent a consent to extend it, I will honor the Senate rules and allow my time to expire at noon, so there's nothing to yield. And I will note Senator Sessions is standing if he cares to.
Madam President, will the Senator yield for a question?
I will yield with a question without yielding the floor.
Senator,
I'm the Majority Leader.
Madam President, parliamentary inquiry, Madam President.
Does the senator from Texas yield for a parliamentary inquiry?
Given that the Majority Leader has cut off our time in 20 minutes, no, I'm sorry, I do not. The Majority Leader was welcome to come down any time in the past 20 hours and ask parliamentary inquiries or questions any time. I would note that Senator Durbin did so, Senator Kaine did so, other senators did so, and at this point, our time is expiring, and I want to allow other Republican senators who have appeared and asked to ask questions to have the opportunity to do so.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Can I direct a question to my friend from Texas?
Does the senator yield for a question?
I will yield for one more question without yielding the floor.
Here's a question. You seem to not understand that you have, after the prayer is given at 12 o'clock, you have time until 1 o'clock. And during that period of time, my question was, because you still have the floor, would you yield 15 minutes of that to John McCain?
It is my intention, if the consent request that I asked is not agreed to accept the end of this at noon under the Senate rules.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Madam President.
Does the senator from Texas yield
for a question?
For a question.
I'm happy to yield for a question without yielding the floor.
I thought that was a very gracious question or offer of unanimous consent that we would vitiate the vote and 30 hours of debate, and you asked very little in exchange for it other than to continue, I guess, to talk.
And actually, let me briefly clarify, I asked nothing in exchange for that. None of those were contingent on each other. Those were three independent unanimous consent requests, which are simply the Majority Leader wanted to consent to any of those. Those were not, it wasn't an offer of horse trade. It was simply, I think all three of those make sense. I think any one of the three of them makes sense. If he chooses to reject them all, that's his prerogative, and that's fine. I was just suggesting we not waste this body's time by doing so.
Well, to follow up on that, then it seems to me that what you were saying would be an offer that would most everyone here would be pleased to receive and accept, unless they have some surreptitious motive. In addition, I think your request to be allowed to continue to speak is reasonable. I think you've earned the right to ask that. You've now spoken, and the American people are watching. Fourth longest time, I believe, any filibuster or just floor time has been held by a senator. I think that's a perfectly reasonable request to allow you to continue to express the concerns that you've expressed. So I'm somewhat taken aback that it wasn't agreed to, and but to just again to make clear, it would seem to me little, if any, reason that they would object to that. Majority would object to that.
Well, I thank my friend from Alabama, and I would note that unfortunately, I'm not surprised that none of those consent were taken. I note the first two consents, one would think would be quite amenable, and yet, look, throughout this debate, the problem has been the majority does not want to listen to the American people and doesn't want to debate in front of the American people, particularly about the merits of Obamacare. They don't want to talk about how Obamacare is failing millions of Americans. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are losing their jobs or not being hired. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are facing being pushed into part-time work. They don't want to talk about how millions of Americans are either losing their health insurance or at risk of losing their health insurance. And so this process is all about, sadly, the Democratic majority not listening to the American people. And the whole purpose of this filibuster was to do everything we could to draw this issue to the attention of the American people so the American people could be heard, and if the American people speak with sufficient volume, I continue to have confidence that this body, that the senators on both sides of the aisle will have no choice but listen.